My name is Jake Miriovsky, Project Manager for JEO Consulting Group. With me is Nick McCready, Lead Project Engineer on the Lower Loup NRD North Loop Flood Reduction Study. The project goals and objectives are listed below. To gather existing data on the watershed, assess and provide recommendations for localized flood reduction, to develop alternatives for riverine flood reduction, to evaluate the alternatives developed via hydraulic modeling and cost estimating, and to provide recommendations and a summary of the study in a final report. The Mira Creek watershed is shown on this map, outlined in red. It is approximately 66 square miles and drains easterly towards North Loop and eventually to the North Loop River. This graphic shows outputs from our HECRAS model of the riverine flooding in the immediate proximity of North Loop. Varied depths are shown in the darker and lighter shades of blue. The interior drainage part of the project mentioned earlier is shown here. The light blue areas show ponding in the town of North Loop during rainfall events. So first we'll talk about the interior drainage part of the project. Some of the main concerns that we found through our assessment and mapping of the flow network through town were plugged culverts and ditches as shown in the photos on this slide. With our analysis of the existing storm drainage network in North Loop, we identified 3 primary outfall locations circled in yellow on this map. 2 of them at the ends of C and B streets on the north edge of town, which discharge into Mira Creek. The other on the east side of town, which takes water easterly towards the river in a county road ditch. There is a small portion of underground storm sewer network shown in red here. The improvements we recommend are primarily ditch cleanout and culvert cleanout, and that would generally be prioritized in the shaded area shown on this map, the northeast quadrant of town. The summary of our recommendations related to the interior drainage, again, prioritize northeast quadrant of town, ditch and culvert cleanout, as well as the B and C streets as they carry most of the water from town north to the creek. We developed a cost estimate of approximately $6,000 per one side of a city block for these improvements. The next step of the interior drainage recommendations would be to develop a stormwater master plan. That would provide more detailed survey data collection to allow for more detailed hydrology and hydraulic analysis, which would therefore provide for refinement of project priorities and cost estimates. So with the stormwater master plan, the town of North Loop would be able to know exactly which streets to work on first. Here is a graphic showing the existing conditions for the 100-year storm event. This is where we're transitioning to talk more about the riverine flooding and the flood reduction alternatives associated with the watershed-wide flooding. So with that, I will transition to Nick to pick it up and talk through some of the next slides.
Thanks, Jake. What we're looking at here is the existing conditions on the 100-year storm event for the riverine flooding in North Loop. Inside the city of North Loop, you're seeing flood depths anywhere from 1 to 3 feet. Here's a hydrograph produced from this storm event. The max flow rate for the Q100 storm is approximately 9,500 cubic feet per second. For the Q50, this equates to almost 7,000 CFS. The Q100 has a 1% annual chance of reoccurring, while the Q50 has a 2% chance. It's important to note that the actual channel of Mira Creek only holds approximately 1,000 CFS. So every time the creek has a flow over this 1,000, you can see flooding outside the banks. What we're looking at here is the difference between the 100-year and the 500-year storm. Basically, the flood extents are similar. However, on the 50-year, the depths are not quite as deep, as the flooding is only approximately 1 to 2 feet tall. So the alternatives we evaluated for this study were small dams. We looked at 3 different dams up in the watershed. We looked at a large dam. We looked at a berm on the south side of Mira Creek. We looked at 2 different diversion channel options. We looked at detention cells on the south branch of Mira Creek. We looked at cleaning out the channel, and then we looked at different combinations of alternatives. Here is a map showing all the different alternatives that were evaluated. You can see the 3 small dams and the 1 large dam in the watershed. Also near the city of North Loup, you can see the diversion channel and the flood control berm. The detention cell is shown in orange on the south branch. What we're looking at here are the alternatives that did not have a large effect for retaining floodwater. Essentially, the small diversion channel and the small dams alternatives did not do a very good job of reducing floodwater in North Loup. You can see the existing conditions on the left and the small dams on the right, and there is hardly any difference between the 2 scenarios. So now we're going to look at the alternatives that actually had a moderate to significant effect of lowering the floodwaters in North Loup. Here you can see a photo of the large dam. This was taken from our model that we used to analyze the effects. The large dam is up in the watershed approximately 5 miles. You can see the city of North Loup on the right side of the screen. The large dam we looked at is anywhere from 1,400 to 1,800 feet in length, could be anywhere from 45 to 60 foot tall, and could have anywhere from a 200 to a 400 acre foot pool. The effects of the large dam showed a moderate reduction in flood depths in North Loup. You can see the before picture on the left and the after on the right. The extents of the flooding were still shown in North Loup. However, the depths are not as significant. This leads to a moderate reduction in floodwaters in North Loup from a large dam. Here is a detailed cost estimate of the proposed alternative for the large dam. It equates to just over $7 million, and this includes construction costs, future engineering costs, and land acquisition. The pros and cons of the large dam are as such. The pros, the dam reduces peak flow by up to 3,600 cubic feet per second and reduces the 48-hour volume accumulation by 5,000 acre feet, which is approximately 52%. This equates to a moderate reduction of floodwaters in North Loup. The dam could also be used for recreation and multi-use. The cons of this are landowner impacts due to the size of the dam, and there is a breached structure that is upstream that breached back in 2010. The next alternative is the berm. You can see the proposed berm alignment shown in red. The berm runs just along the south of Mira Creek and ties into the railroad tracks up north and a high piece of ground to the west of Highway 11. Here's a before and after of the model showing the effects of the berm. You can see the berm shown in red. The after shows almost a near elimination of the floodwaters in North Loup. The small amount of blue you can see is interior ponding, and this would be addressed with interior drainage improvements. However, the berm holds back the riverine flooding and protects North Loup from the flood effects. Here's a detailed cost estimate for the berm. The berm comes in at a total cost of over $1 million. This includes construction, engineering, and land acquisition. There is a relatively low construction cost due to the smaller footprint of this. However, the majority of the cost comes from land acquisition, which is residential and agricultural. The pros of the berm are it provides significant flood protection from Mira Creek. This comes at a relatively lower cost and smaller footprint. The cons of this are potential public buy-in and optic issues that would come with residential buyouts. This doesn't reduce the peak flow rate or flood volume coming down Mira Creek. The flood depths increased in a small area up north near the railroad bridge. However, this would be short-term and it was less than 1 foot. The next option is the large diversion channel. You can see the diversion channel that connects to the Mira Creek west of Highway 11 and runs to the north and the east and connects near the county road. The diversion channel is approximately 20 foot wide at the bottom, 100 foot wide at the top, and is contained by 2 berms on each side that are approximately 7 feet tall. Each of these berms are approximately 500 feet apart. The diversion channel provides significant flood protection from Mira Creek. The diversion of this occurs through the diversion of floodwaters away from North Loop. There are several cons to this option. One, it has a considerable footprint, and there would be large land buyouts. Also, this option would cross the highway, railroad, and several county roads, which would lead to the construction of several new bridges. This option doesn't reduce peak flow or the volume accumulation over a time period. This project has a high cost and it has potential downstream impacts. Here's a before and after showing the effects of the diversion channel. You can see how the diversion channel conveys nearly all the floodwater away from Mira Creek and North Loop up to the north and away from town. The small amounts of interior ponding would also be addressed with interior drainage improvements. Here's a detailed cost estimate of the diversion channel. This option comes in at approximately $16 million. The next option are detention cells. These are located on the south branch of Mira Creek, approximately several miles from town. These are large detention cells that are approximately 300 acres in size and would equate to over 3 million cubic yards of excavation, which is approximately 6 foot in depth over this area. Here are the before and after effects of the detention pond. There is a moderate reduction in flood depth similar to the large dam on the north branch. However, there still is flooding present in North Loop. This cost estimate shows that this option is the highest cost of all of our alternatives, coming in at almost $20 million. The pros of the detention cells are similar to the large dam in that they reduce the peak flow rate up to a maximum of 2,500 CFS, which is 27% from the existing, and it reduces the volume by 1,900 acre feet, which is 20%. Where this equates to a moderate flood reduction in North Loop. However, this has a large land impact, there is a large amount of spore removal, and this is the highest alternative cost. The channel cleanout would be one of the simpler projects that we could use to lower flood reduction in North Loop. Channel cleanout would involve removing overgrown and downed trees, removing brush, debris, and trash from the channel. This would improve flow conditions and could lower the water surface elevation at certain parts in the channel up to 1/2 foot. This could also be done by the village, the NRD, or the county, or it could be bid out. The red line are the extents that we recommend cleaning out the channel. This includes the channel that's just north of town and approximately 1 mile downstream. Next, we looked at several combinations of the previously discussed alternatives. Here we're looking at the large dam and the detention cells. And what you see is when you combine these two effects, you have a large amount of water that is retained up in the north and south branch, leading to a significant reduction in floodwaters in North Loop. These two options combined show significant reduction in flooding. The small amount of ponding shown would be addressed through interior drainage improvements. Next, we looked at the berm and the small diversion channel. These these two together combined for a significant reduction in floodwater. However, the addition of the diversion channel to the berm does not have any more of an impact than just the berm alone. Next, we look at the large dam and the berm. When you combine the retaining effects of the large dam with the barricading effects of the berm, what you get is a significant reduction of flooding in North Loup. And next, I'll hand it off to Jake to discuss groundwater.
So with the analysis of the alternatives that we described in the previous slides, we did look preliminarily at potential groundwater impacts associated with each of those alternatives. The map shown here shows the various alternatives along with existing groundwater wells, and we developed cross sections through the various alternatives to analyze the potential for groundwater recharge. Shown here are the cross sections developed from the previous overall site map. The most important thing to point out on this figure is the darker brown color, which is the clay material. So the amount of clay beneath the structure, for instance, dam 5, shown on the right side of the graphic, has an impact on the structure's ability to recharge. This figure shows the groundwater level change from pre-development to 2016. The light blue and blue colors on the figure show the highest levels of groundwater increases over that time period. So you can see a large portion of the watershed has seen significant groundwater inclines over that time period. And this table is the summary of our groundwater analysis, calling your attention to the column at the right-hand side of the slide, where it lists relative potential for infiltration and groundwater recharge. This is the result of the cross sections that were analyzed in the previous few slides to come up with a relative figure for what anticipated groundwater recharge would be for each of these structures. So you can see dam 5 has a low potential for groundwater recharge, some of the others moderate to high. The conclusion with this is that more detailed geotechnical analysis would be required for the alternatives that would move forward to come up with quantitative results related to groundwater recharge. Back to the alternatives developed and analyzed with this study, the table below is a summary of the costs for each of those alternatives and the combinations of various alternatives. As shown and as described by Nick, the large diversion channel and the detention ponds have a very high cost associated with them. Some lower costs are seen with some of the combinations, and that includes the preferred alternative that we recommend, highlighted in red at the bottom, the berm, the big dam, and the channel cleanout at approximately $8.6 million total cost. Again, looking at the map of the watershed, showing the locations of those preferred alternatives, the large dam on the north branch of Mira Creek, approximately in the center of the watershed, and the flood control berm and the channel cleanout adjacent to the town of North Loup. Again, the summary of the combination of alternatives we are recommending, the channel cleanout being the easiest of the three options to move forward with. First, it is the lowest cost of the three alternatives listed in the combination, and as Nick described, some immediate benefits in flood reduction will be realized with that. Then the berm and the large dam, higher costs items with that combination. And then, of course, the interior drainage improvements, which were described earlier, are also very important to conveying floodwater out of town and away from town. So this graphic shows the before the existing conditions model and the proposed conditions with the preferred alternative. As you can see on the right, virtually zero flooding in North Loop with the combination of the large dam, the berm, channel cleanout, and the interior drainage improvements. This graphic shows the floodwater surface elevation change with the preferred alternatives. The most important thing to show here is the orange color, the 0 to 1 foot rise in floodwater surface elevation. So just a minor impact to a small amount of ag land, and for a very short duration would see a 0 to 1 foot rise in floodwater elevation. To talk about funding of the alternatives and the projects that we recommended in the previous slides, one of the first funding sources that would be eligible is the Water Sustainability Fund through the Natural Resources Commission here in the state of Nebraska. That's a 60-40 cost share, 40 being the local portion. The next applicable funding source is the Watershed Flood Prevention Operations, WFPO, through the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS. The first step of that funding source would be to develop a plan and environmental assessment for the watershed. That would be 100% paid by the NRCS program. The second step is the design and construction. One thing to note is that the NRCS WFPO funding does not cover the permitting and land rights costs associated with the project. So there's generally still going to be a gap in the funding that must come from some other source. And of course, that could be the local funding. So our funding recommendations would be to apply for the WFPO grant this year to establish that step 1 watershed plan. That's typically an 18-month process. And the study that we are currently working to complete would expedite that planning process. The next step would be the step 2 I mentioned in the previous slide, applying for WFPO design and construction funding. Now, the water sustainability funding previously mentioned could be used to cover the other remaining costs, the land rights and permitting, to help narrow the gap in funding needs. Thank you everyone for viewing our presentation on the North Loop flood study for Lower Loop NRD. The NRD and JEO are asking for public feedback. The presentation can be found on the NRD's website, and a feedback period of April 17th to May 8th is requested. The final report is scheduled to be delivered to the Lower Loop NRD board in May of this year. Contact information for providing public feedback is listed below.